Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Hanger DX podcast, where we talk about everything related to developer experience. And I'm really excited for a session today with Luca here, who runs one of the biggest communities on platform engineering. So we were going to dive into everything related to platform engineering. So before we get started, Luca, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Luca. I run, as you said, a core contributor of the platform engineering community, the largest one out there. Also host of PlatformCon, which is our big annual event with over 40,000 people attending. All sort of like platform engineering practitioners from all walk of life, and I guess we'll get a little bit more into what that means today. And I also write a newsletter, Platform Weekly, that goes out to over 100,000 people every week. So in general, I speak to a lot of platform teams and try and figure out, what works, what doesn't, and then sort of spread the love.
Amazing. And Luca is joining us today from somewhere in the wild in a van. So this is definitely a first for us. Very excited.
Yes.
So, Luca, I'm going to straight up dive into our core topic of discussion, which is even like really helping define what platform engineering is. I know, like, actually, there are a lot of people in our Hanger DX community also who even hate the term platform engineering just because it can mean just hundreds of different things. But I would want your perspective, given that you run one of the largest conferences here or like communities here. What is platform engineering for you?
Yeah. And, to all the people that hate it, I definitely recommend joining the community because one of the biggest, things that I care about for me is really that platform engineering doesn't end up like DevOps, GitOps before it, which to your point means kind of like everything and nothing, but that, stays, consistent to a definition and that a definition that actually provides clarity and value. And that definition for me is, platform engineering is a discipline that it's really about taking sort of like the tech and tools that you have like floating in your engineering organization today and binding them into golden paths, right? That kind of abstract the underlying infrastructural complexity, that shield the developers from that complexity, and enable self-service for the individual contributor, for the developer, right? That's really the core of platform engineering for me, and that sort of like the sum of those golden paths is an internal developer platform, or IDP for short, which is really a platform that is built as a product. So, this is a concept that we're probably going to explore in our conversation. This idea of platform as a product is one of the core principles that we really kind of push in the platform engineering community. Um, and that is also ultimately what differentiates platform engineering and a platform engineer from, adjacent sort of disciplines like DevOps, SRE, and things that came before it.
Interesting. So there are a lot of different things I want to talk about, but let's kind of like start with some of the threads that you just shared. Um, in my thought process, there is this concept of inner loop and outer loop. So inner loop is kind of like focus more around developer workflows, kind of like code reviews and like CI workflows. Outer loop is more around like a production infrastructure, right? Kind of like how your code is deployed, how you kind of like made scalable, observability, those kind of aspects. So from your aspect perspective, is platform engineering a combination of two, or is it kind of like focusing on one or the other loops?
Yeah, it's definitely both. I think it's the form. So the inner loop is really where you get developers on board, right? Because with your platform engineering initiative, right? Because I think one of the things, why does platform engineering even exist, right? If you take a step back, if you look back like 30 years, right, you had this idea of like, let's just throw our code over the fence, and then there's a poor sysadmin somewhere that needs to figure that out. Then the sort of like the pendulum swung the other way, and it was like, okay, you know, DevOps, you build it, you run it, shift everything left to the developer, and then kind of what leading engineer organizations realized in the last 15 years, it was like, hey, that doesn't work. I can't expect my latest junior front end to onboard to this increasingly complex infrastructure and just like do everything. I need to build some sort of platform layer in between them and infrastructure, in between them and the operations colleagues, and that's kind of what platform engineering is about. And then it's been trickling down to the rest of the industry in the last, especially like 5 years or so. And so in that sense, right, the thing that developers are really struggling with in non-platform engineering driven setups today is this idea of like, okay, I'm just overwhelmed with all the complexity that's out there, right? Like I'm kind of like stuck looking at this. I don't really sure, I need to touch a Terraform file. I need to touch like a Kubernetes manifest. I need to touch, all these different components of a very complex tool chain just in order to, basically do my inner loop, like doing it like a to deploy a small code change and test it and iterate on that, right? And but anyways, the way you sell your platform engineering initiative to the developer is, basically, hey, we're going to improve your inner loop. You're going to be able to self-serve anything you need to do those like quick iterations without having to wait for 2 weeks for your ops colleagues to provision a database for you, right? Like that's really so that's really where I think platform engineering starts, also because ultimately, the end user of your platform is really the application developer, right? However, it then goes all the way to production, right? And that's actually one thing that, if you think about platform engineering, is usually like a relatively complete and slash complex org transformation that really touches all the different stakeholders within an engineering organization, right? So it obviously touches developers. We just covered that. It also touches infrastructure teams. It touches security teams. It touches architects, legal and compliance, and so on. And those groups are obviously interested in the entire kind of like life cycle, right? So from dev and staging to production and so on, as well as, to your point, like what's the observability stack on top of that and so on. And so there, platforms, well designed, well architected platforms can really be seen as a automated and standardized way of driving that sort of compliance, security, governance by design across not just your development, but also your production workflows and across all your teams, right? And so that's really, when I think about what are the key value propositions of platform engineering initiatives across these different stakeholder groups, is really automation and self-service on the developers side, and then really kind of like sort of like security guardrails and standardization on the infrastructure and architecture side of things.
Interesting. So you brought in a lot of different perspectives. So, in the sense, like a lot of different stakeholders, rather, in this conversation, right? So,
Mhm.
I'm gonna like do maybe a couple of hot takes, and you can kind of like figure out like how to
Let's do it.
put your hype around it. So, one is, I feel like platform engineering today is just a rebranding of DevOps, what used to be. So in a way, kind of like, there used to be DevOps, there used to be sort of like admins also who are like managing, for instance, your GitHub infrastructure or your GitLab infrastructure. All of those have sort of like come together and rebranded themselves as platform engineer. Like, what do you think about that?
I think it's true. Unfortunately, I think there's a like we see this a lot, where there's a lot of teams that are like, okay, platform engineering is a hot new thing, like DevOps used to be like 10, 15 years ago. So let's rebrand all sysadmins to DevOps, and now let's rebrand all DevOps to platform engineers. And a lot of the work that we do with the community is not just like sort of like setting definition and standards, but is also actually like helping enterprise teams, head of platforms that usually inherit this kind of like rebranded hodgepodge of like DevOps plus SRE plus cloud ops and so on in one thing, and like actually help them like going from 0 to 1 and like upskill them into platform engineering, because just rebranding is not enough. Now, where's the difference? We talked about this like pendulum earlier. We went from like complete separation and complete silos to shift everything left. Everybody does everything, which I think if you think about it from a evolution of industry perspective, is very interesting, because we're the software complex industry is the only one virtually, I think, since the 1800s, since the industrial revolution, where saying, hey, let's have everybody doing everything seemed like a good idea. Like virtually everywhere else, there's been like a constant trend of specialization and of effectively assembly line work, right, where you just specialize on your part of whatever it is that you're doing. And I think the way that software is built in a lot of mid-size and large size and all size really engineer organization is more like a craftsman, like a carpenter, right? Like where it's like they know what tree I need for that chair, and then they craft the entire chair. It's again, it's not scalable at all, right? Like, and there's no standards, there's no like standardized, screws, and and so what you really want to do is have IKEA, right? From like an output and throughput perspective. And we can get into what that means culturally, because obviously a lot of engineers hate the fact of being put on an assembly line, and everybody wants to be an artist. But I think the pendulum just like swung a little bit too far that direction. And what platform engineering really is an evolution of DevOps, right? That says, look, this idea of you build it, you run it is in theory good. In practice, it doesn't scale, right? When you go, it works if you're like 10, 15 people and everybody's is very familiar with your tech stack, and you can, everybody can do Kubernetes and Terraform and everything you need. It doesn't scale to 2,000 developers and very complex infrastructural setup. It just doesn't. And so what platform engineering is really saying, look, we need that platform layer. We need those silos. But so silos are good, which is funny because when you say that thing, like people freak out. But silos are a good thing. You just need to build them in a way that there's like efficient communication in between the silos. And that's what the platform is, right? And so that's really what platform engineering is about, is, we like in the community famously had like a very inflammatory debate like a couple of years ago on like DevOps is dead, long live platform engineering type of thing, which was like a very viral snippet that did just that. It went viral. Of course, platform engineering is not a DevOps killer. It's just like an evolution of it. But I think it's also just important to point out there are a lot of things that currently, especially in enterprise engineering organizations, are just not working.
Interesting. So again, there's a lot of things to unpack there. Maybe kind of like at least one of the things that you mentioned around like standardization. This is a very common topic we also talk about in our Hanger DX community, which is um, standardization is definitely important. I feel everyone agrees with it, but there is a nuance to it where if you always follow the same standards, how do you
Mm-hmm.
really innovate? Like, have you
Mm-hmm.
kind of like removed all the possibilities of like thinking about certain architecture, certain design,
Mm-hmm.
certain tools in a new way, right? Like if there are like
Right.
new technologies coming in, how do you kind of like step away from your standards to go and explore them and
Right.
think about that and bringing them back into the platform?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that that's really about, when we talk about standardization, to me is about, okay, right now, if you think about the 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 life of the average DevOps, right, is kind of, or like infrastructure engineers, like, okay, I need to like, firefight all this like fires that get started by developers all the time. I need to answer all this inbound ticket ops requests of like, hey, stand up this, stand up that, and so on, right? Um, and the problem with that is I end up doing a lot of manual work, which then creates this lack of standardization, this lack of security. It's not repeatable, it's not scalable, and so on, right? And so you really want to address that. And the way you do that, I think, is by creating, the standardized golden paths, the standardized templates that are kind of like designed and then automatically enforced across your different development teams, your different development workflows. And that's what makes the whole thing scalable. And that's what lets the entire thing, the entire, system move faster without breaking things, right? Which is really what, especially in the enterprise, most engineering organizations are aiming to do. Not necessarily moving fast as an absolute, right? But at least moving faster than where they are right now, while making sure that their developers are not going to, create insane costs or create insane security breaches or so on, right? And so then, to your point, if you think about that standardization in the form of golden paths, um, how do you make sure you don't get stuck, right? I think there it's really about this like platform as a product approach, right? Like you have to look at your platform as an internal product that you're building for your internal customers who are the application developers. The moment you look at that way, right, you're basically, your platform team is a startup that's serving a total addressable market. That's the side of your engineering work. And um, and so good products, right, like just listen to the market, right, and like keep evolving, right, and that's really essential, for the continuous adoption of the platform and for the success overall of the platform engineering initiative. And it's very important in that sense that you not only build the path, but also the option to go off path, and essentially, uh, not having your platform just being an enforcing mechanism of best practices, but also a discovery mechanism, where if like this like off path thing gets requested like once or twice, then whatever, it's just like it's an edge case. If it gets requested like 100 times, then that's clearly your discovery mechanism to see, okay, we now need to build a new golden path for this specific use case, right? And that's how you basically, and that's essentially how the system keeps evolving, right?
Interesting. So I'm going to come to kind of like, obviously IDPs, which is going to be a big part of this conversation as well. I'm going to maybe start with a little bit more opinionated question, which is,
Mm-hmm.
do companies even need IDPs? Can there be a platform strategy without an IDP? Because at least I know many of the folks in our community, for instance, don't have an IDP. And it's not like I mean, some of them have tried building one and kind of like, have not succeeded. But some of them also feel like maybe there is not a need. So I would
Mm-hmm.
love to hear from your perspective, given that you've worked in this space for last several years. Um, can there be a platform strategy without IDP, or what is your kind of like overall take on where IDP fits in this strategy?
Yeah. So my hot take is no, there can't be. And the the reason I think there's this like quote that I am going to butcher, but it's kind of like, if you're not going to build your platform, it's going to build itself, right? And I think that's like a very interesting way of thinking about it, because again, it's not that once you hit a certain scale, you magically solve all these problems that we just talked about with, just with nothing, right? Like there's going to be something, right? And so the question is like, how do you drive automation? How do you drive standardization? And so there can be like a formal kind of like platform initiative around this, or there can be sort of like a bottom up, platform that just like forms and like that kind of like emerges into existence, right? Um, and and so I think you end up having a platform either way. And in fact, I would say a lot of the people that, especially 3, 4, 5 years ago, when platform engineering was not as popular yet, when I was first having these conversations, people were like, well, I'm a DevOps engineer, but you really we've been building platforms this whole time, and which is like totally fair. Like I think that's exactly what happens once you cross that sort of like 1 to 100 developers kind of size as an engineering org. You need something, right? Like again, you can have pure DevOps where like everybody does the entire thing, um, up to like 20, 30, whatever. Then when you start having like 50, 80 plus is when you start seeing like a sort of like unbranded platform team form, of people that just spend and basically 100% of their time maintaining this thing, whatever this thing is, and then you have the choice after that. It's like, are you going to do it, or you're just going to keep like patching it as you go, right? And it's not necessarily that like a super formal, super structured thing needs to be in place at a scale up size, but certainly at the enterprise, there's also like, it's not gonna I think the economy of the scale of having like a formal platform engineering initiative are crushing the, if you have just like a bunch of bottom up sort of like emerging property style platforms that just like pop here and there, because at the end of the day, you're just like a local maximum. You have a bunch of local maxima basically, that they're getting optimized against, and no like real, and so it's kind of like, okay, your platform is optimizing this local part, so it's better than if you don't have it there. But then you kind of just like, kick the can down the road, and now you have like a bigger misalignment problem on the large, also like the level higher. Um, so yeah, so I would say, I think after a certain size, it definitely is very beneficial to just say, hey, let's actually be sort of mindful about this and do it properly. There are certainly some high performing engineering organizations at like sort of a smaller size, scale up size that can still get by, I think, but I don't think it's a sustainable long term plan.
Interesting. Okay, I'm gonna continue on my hot take streak. So, one of the things, actually, like I also wrote an article about that. I don't know whether I shared that with you earlier. I mentioned in that article, like, the modern IDPs tend to be more like a platform, or sorry, like a product or a dashboard for platform teams. What that means is,
Hmm.
like, it's more relevant for platform teams so that they can kind of like look at, oh, how things are going, how is our infrastructure, how are the all the services performing, if there's an incident, who owns those things, which are in some ways less relevant for a day-to-day developer versus kind of like people who are managing the infrastructure. And I think related second hot take is the other user of these IDPs tend to be sort of like leadership who want to understand what's happening in the organization, which is kind of like, in some ways, like now we're going back to those developer productivity metrics where leadership want to kind of like keep a track on their developers. And which is also kind of like, in some ways, I feel IDPs are also like rebranded those productivity metric uh, uh, dashboards. So I feel like these are the more common use cases of IDPs rather than for a end developer who's kind of like mostly working on product features. Like, how are the end developers working on product features getting value out of IDPs?
Yeah, I love this question because I think really the core of it is in IDP, which is what you're describing is what a lot of people think of as an IDP, and that's one of the biggest issues uh, that I've spent a lot of time. You and I were talking offline earlier. Like I spent countless hours of my life like explaining the difference between internal developer platforms and internal developer portals. So here we go again. But the you know what you're talking about is an internal developer portal, right? And you're totally right. Like I think an internal developer portal is um, it, it's basically just like a UI on top of your setup. It's what allows your platform infrastructure team to see what's going on. And it's what and it's and everybody like why do they like it, right? Because people are like, okay, I need to do platform engineering. Let me just slap like a portal on top of my current setup and call it a day. And plus, hey, executives like it because your point, it now gives them a dashboard to see developer productivity metrics, right? You have solved no problem and you have not really helped the developers. Um, and that's really the problem with portals, right? But when you're doing actual platform engineering and you're building an internal developer platform, right? And so we've open sourced these reference architectures for internal developer platforms, which are really just like if you think about it, the way you should think about building a platform again is building like an internal product, is building like any application. So you have a backend, you have a front end. You should start from the backend, by the way, and the portal is just your front end, right? And it's one of the possible front ends, right? You could have a CLI driven architecture. You could have like a UI, which is mostly like a portal. You could have now like a chat based interface, right? Which is one of the things that we're working on. It's you can have a API, you can have whatever, right? Like, but at the end of the day, you could also just like a code base interaction. And but the thing that's really going to address your kind of like developer issues is the backend, right? Because that's really the thing that's focused on streamlining application configuration, infrastructure orchestration, which is really where the pain is. The problem is a lot of times when people look at like, okay, I want to improve developer experience, they look at it chronologically, right? So they look at like, okay, what is the first thing the developer does? Like service creation. Great, except that like how often do they actually do service creation? It's like one in a like once a year. I don't know, like so like of course, and the problem is like backstage comes from Spotify, right? Which is like the really like when we talk about portals, we're talking about backstage, right? There's like some recent data by GetDX Abinoda there who like literally just like sent a newsletter this week, I think, where he was showing, and this is consistent with the data from our community, data from Gartner, data from ThoughtWorks. So a lot of like analysts in the space, it's basically like over 90%. It's not even like when we say portal, it's like totally backstage. And backstage was open source by Spotify. So like if you're Spotify, maybe you do end up creating services a lot faster, right? But the reality is that your average engineering organization is not Spotify, and so you shouldn't over index and over optimize on that. And so again, if you think about this like developer experience flow, right? Like that is not where the pain is right now. The pain is in handling, dealing with like application configuration, infrastructure configuration, all of those things. And that's where an internal developer platform is actually addressing, right? And then it provides you a nice sort of like observability portal layer on top to get visibility throughout. But that's not the thing that solves the problems, and I think that's really, really important to understand. And actually, in fact, we are updating the reference architectures. They're not live yet, but one of the things that we're going to do is actually having sort of like having an observability layer on top and portals as part of that, because that's really, I think, and that's actually, I think for most people would be a hot take, because right now they still see them as these separate things. In my opinion, it doesn't make any sense, because to the point of what you were saying, right? Like, it's just like observability rebranded, basically. Like, that's the main value that it provides to you. And so why wouldn't Datadog have the number one portal offering? They just launched actually a portal offering like a couple of weeks ago. So like, I think that's kind of where the industry is going towards. And speaking to other observability vendors, they're also sort of looking at that way. And so it's becoming much more of a red ocean than I think most people think. And but that's really the core for me is and I think, again, one of the I think normal challenges of new disciplines, new emerging fields like platform engineering, is still this like uncertainty around its definitions and around what is what. And unfortunately, when we first launched this idea of an internal developer platform, we launched internal developer platform.org back like 5 years ago. That started getting a lot of traction in the space. And then, you had a lot of vendors that saw the success of Backstage as a portal, as an open source offering, but obviously, Backstage being open source is a bit complex to like implement. It takes you 6 months, and then actually, to your point, it gets no developer adoption. Guess why? Because it doesn't solve developer problems, right? But all these vendors, back in 2019, 2020, when all of us could get a lot of money from VCs, kind of like went on and like, hey, perfect, let me take a bunch of VC money and build this like closed source, like easier to implement thing, which is fine and good for them. And a lot of them have grown really fast, but they sort of all piggybacked of this like internal developer platform abbreviation, right? And so they're like, oh, IDP is a thing, cool, I'm going to run with it, except it's like internal developer portal, and that has created massive confusion in the space. And so hence here I am explaining it again. But I think that's really like, I think what the main takeaway I would say for people is like, look, building a platform is like building any application. Back end, front end, stuff from the back end, that's where you define the architecture, that's where you solve the real problems. Front end is whatever, it's just like an interchangeable interface on top of it.
Interesting. I know there's a lot of things I want to kind of like cover, but like I want to at least still double click here, especially for like folks who are like listening in and like still really trying to put their head around like IDPs and kind of like value of it. Let's say more specifically, there are product engineers like developers in an organization, right? Maybe like some folks who have joined new or who've been in the company for some time. Like, what is it that they're doing day to day that they get value from IDP, or like sort of like if we think about like success of using an IDP or like adoption of an IDP, um, how is a developer's interaction who's not a infrastructure engineer, like kind of like who's a product engineer, what is a developer typically doing that is getting value, that they're getting value from IDP on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. And we can also maybe quickly touch on the other stakeholders too, because I think it's, again, like this platform engineering is really like a multiplayer game, right? So you do need to get everybody on board. There's, I think, an over indexing on just what can we do for developers. And then the problem is like you're leaving your infrastructure people behind, your security people behind. And that's just like a death sentence on your platform engineering initiative. But to answer your question, like, because developers are the main user, right? Like, I think if you look at today in most enterprise organizations that I speak to, a developer takes literally weeks to get something back, right? It's like, hey, I need an environment, I need a Postgres database. It's like, cool, wait a couple of weeks and then we'll get back to you, right? That's literally what happens right now. And so I think from developer perspective, you have a few issues. You have A, you're stuck waiting. B, you are overwhelmed and you're afraid of screwing things up because you don't want to touch that script that you don't really understand how it connects to the other, snippet, and then like, screw things up. And then the sort of like one of the derivatives of that is then what I call shadow operations, which is basically, because your central ops team is this like huge clogged up bottleneck from an organization perspective, your developers end up your senior developers end up jumping in and helping their junior developers, your more junior their more junior colleagues, and so they end up doing like what I call shadow operations, right? And that's like just compounds this like organizational problem, right? Because now you have your most prized development resources doing ops work and not doing development work, right? And so that's kind of like this like spiral. Um, and that's really what platform engineering addresses, right? Is this idea of like, hey, you can have like actual developer self-service, right? So developers can just like click a button if it's a UI, or run a command on a CLI or whatever, right? And they get what they need, right, to do their job quickly, while and safely, right? So while securely, while being sure that this thing is the latest template that's security approved or whatever, right? So that's the value for developers. The just really quickly, the important thing is then like, what's the value for the infrastructure people? It's like, well, you no longer have to field ticket ops your entire life, or like 40% of your time, but like actually, that's reduced to like maybe 5% of the time on this like kind of like off path edge case that we were talking about, and you can actually focus on like building real infrastructure, adding work on production, and not like on sending up the nth database for the nth time. Um, and um, and really the way you sell the platform initiative to them is as effectively as like vending machine layer for whatever you're providing, that then can be like sort of like consumed autonomously by developers. And then we can also talk about like how you sell it to security and kind of like architects and executives. But that's really like, it's very important that, and this is I think one of the tricky things of platform engineering, by the way. It's like a good platform product manager needs to be able to not just be technical enough to communicate with infrastructure and DevOps folks that have like 20 years experience, right? But also being a good enough communicator to literally switch lingo as they go from like speaking to developers. Because if you speak to developers about cutting time to market, you can be sure they're not going to care, right? What they care about is like, well, waiting times, I'm stuck, developer experience, and so on. Um, um, and the flip side of that is like, if you go and talk to executives about developer experience, as much as they say they care about it, I still have to see a CTO that actually puts money there, and or it's a more challenging thing. What they care about is like cutting time to market, employee retention, my bottom line, my top line, and so on. And so that's how you need to position the platform engineering initiative there.
Very interesting. So, for the folks who are like listening in here and kind of like are platform engineers or like platform engineering leaders, do you have any thoughts on like maybe from your experience, where have you seen sort of like the platform engineering fail or failure to adoption, and what can these people do to avoid these pitfalls?
Yeah, there's a lot of them, but I think like um what I've been focusing on recently is kind of like a few threads that we sort of touched on, right? Like this idea that I think like what I see a lot of heads of platforms struggling with today is this like rebranded hodgepodge that we touched on earlier, right? Like this idea of like, you now have been brought in by company X to company Y, you have inherited this like mixed bag of sort of DevOps, SRE, cloud ops, infra, and now they're all like platform engineers, except that nobody actually knows what platform engineering even is. And so where do you go from there, right? And I think um, one of the sort of solutions that people try and go after is this like technical product manager, right? Which is seen as this like uh, magical solution to like, I'm just going to bring them in, everything is going to be solved. And I think that's one of the key challenges here, because that's really the 2080, not the 80/20. Will it help? Yes, for sure. Like bringing this like technical and good communicator, right? Great. But it's very very hard, and they're almost like a unicorn to find. Like it's very very hard to find them, for a few reasons, right? Again, very hard sort of like Venn diagram of skills to find. But then also, even when you do have them, for example in the enterprise, they're usually allocated to external facing products, because your internal initiatives is just seen as a cost center, not as a sort of like value generating activity. um, so very challenging to do. And even when you do find them, um, you're still not going to get everybody else really on board, right? There's still like your 20 years 20 plus years experience DevOps engineer that thinks about your platform as a one and done 6 months infrastructure project, as opposed to a product with a life cycle of like 5 plus years, right? And that's really the challenge, right? And so I think you're much better off sort of like trying to raise all boats. And I think that's really the 80/20. And then you can like, sprinkle on top some like really good product management if you find them. But you're much better off like really instilling that like basic, we're talking about basic product management kind of like understanding in these people, because that's going to unlock a bunch of different things. Because I think the interesting thing about um, looking at your platform as a product, and looking at your developers as customers, is that all of a sudden you unlock like 20-30 years of product management best practices, from user-centric design to user research to product marketing, because you need to go to market with this thing internally. And so you unlock this like world of like ideas and memes that have kind of like evolved in the wild for the last 20-30 years, and you can just like get the best of them and use them, as opposed to look at it again as yet another infrastructure initiative, right? Which is really the wrong way of looking at it. And this is ultimately why we put together, all our courses and certifications, and kind of like enterprise trainings in the community, is really to help kind of like raise those boats within teams. The other I think challenge then is in the few initial. So there's two more I would say. One is, or at least that I want to point out. One is this idea that you and I briefly chatted about earlier. The this idea of kind of like looking at platform engineering as a technical challenge as opposed to a cultural challenge, right? I've yet to see one platform engineering initiative fail because of a tech stack choice, versus not being able to get a developer adoption or different stakeholder buy-in, right? That's really why it's so important to raise elbows. That's really why it's important to think about this as a culture, as an org transformation, and getting everybody on board in this like multi-stakeholder game that we talked about, versus okay, should I go with Pulumi or Terraform? Like it doesn't really matter. And then lastly, I think this like sort of like champion dependency, I think is the other big struggle that I see. Which, to your initial point, it's like it's kind of the same thing over and over again. Like you had the same challenges with like DAO transformation, agile, and all these things before it, right? Where um, it's just like org transformations in the enterprise. Like I think the life cycle of most of them, right, is you kind of just like settle. Like it's like a lot of, again, if you think about it as a startup, like how many startups become unicorns? Like very few, right? Most of them die, and then like if you think about not just startup but just like in general like new companies, like most of them just end up in this like 5 to like 50 million revenue per year range, whatever, and they're just gonna get stuck there. And I think the same thing happens, right? And like why? Because like for example, the owner's making enough money and they're just like complacent or whatever. Like, and you don't have this like founder mode, like whatever. And I think the same thing happened where like, okay, let's say your platform engineering does get off the ground and is successful. Then the next challenge is, okay, now you're like 3-4 years in, you have like 30-40% adoption in the enterprise, which by all means is success, right? So in some cases, you have like already like thousands of developers onboarded to your platform. But then, hey, your champion, your head of platform usually gets a promotion at that point, or gets scooped up by another company, moves somewhere else, whatever. Life happens, and then the problem is that you don't have a resilient sort of organizational structure around us, right? And so they leave, and you kind of just get stuck, right? And that's the plateau adoption, and then you end up in this like limbo of all the other organizational initiatives before that kind of like made it out of the initial swamp, but never really, to full adoption. And I think the key to full adoption is just executive support, right? So that's why it's so
Interesting.
important to being able to attach whatever it is that you're doing to whatever your executives care about, not just this quarter, but like in the next couple of years, because that's how they're going to make sure that that thing keeps driving value for the organization, even if you're gone.
Interesting. Okay, so kind of like just summarize what you're saying is like it's important to have sort of like a product, like a PM mindset, and kind of like involve all the stakeholders while you're thinking about your platform strategy.
Yeah, exactly.
Sweet. Okay, I know we are over time, so maybe just like one last question to ask you, Luca, and then we can wrap it up. is like, obviously, there's no podcast and there's no session without AI. So like, how do you think like AI will play into platform engineering in the next few years?
Yeah, we're actually gonna write. I'm actually writing about this, obviously. But we're going to spend a lot of time in the community on this because I think it's been probably like a couple of years at least now that I hear all the Gartners and the Google, and kind of like the large ecosystem players in the industry saying like, hey, if it wasn't for AI, platform engineering would be the hottest trend, and so, which I think is true. And and so the question is like, okay, what's the intersection? And I think we, for example, see a lot of data engineers joining the community. There's definitely like I already see sort of like the kind of like the leading organization, the top performers thinking about this as just like one unified layer, because why wouldn't you? Right now we're still like I think very scattered. We're just like this like data world and sort of like ML ops data engineering thing over here, and then there's this like DevOps platform engineering thing over here. But like really, and then of course there's like observability security kind of like in between, but really like top performers are converging towards just like one layer in the enterprise, and kind of think about it as one unified architecture, right? And so I think that's kind of like that's where we're going. And in that world, then you have like essentially two things. It's like what does how does platform engineering enable AI, right? And which is I think like the most obvious way of looking at it, right? Because of course, like all your AI models need underlying infrastructure, and like you need all these things, right? But then the flip side of that is like, what does AI enabled platform engineering look like? And I think that's kind of the thing that I'm most interested in to explore in terms of okay, what are how does this change the interaction with human users, right? And how do you go from like expert in the loop to like human in the loop? And there's like a few threads there that are really interesting. There's a big obviously like question around trust, and like who's going to be the one to like crack this like really like because everybody right now is like trying to figure out like how do I do AI, and like how to take like AI and like infrastructure and like smash them together. And like for everybody that's played with like Terraform files and ChatGPT, the main challenge of course is security. Like it's hallucination is like how do you prevent it from making mistakes and so on. And so how do you leverage I think existing solid architectures that have emerged in the last 2 3 years in platform engineering, and combine them with AI so that you can give them that sort of like intuitive experience, but that underneath under the hood is guided by very clear deterministic golden paths, right? Because that's really I think it's how do you combine the sort of the LLM with the deterministic the kind of like behavior there. And so that's one thing that we're exploring a lot, and then there's also like another thread which is just like okay, you can think of like your platform as again having like serving all these human users. How about like agents, right? And like how to like agent to agent, and like how do you chain all these things in your tool chain together. And that's like another very interesting I think thing that we're looking at. So I don't know if I really answered your question, but there's a lot of like interesting stuff.
Sure.
And I'd recommend people just go check out platformengineering.org. I'm going to publish a lot in the next 4 weeks already.
Very cool. And like as you publish, like feel free to share with me, and I can kind of like link some of those things in the podcast as well, so people can easily find it. Sweet. All right. I know we are way over time, so I'm gonna wrap up here. So thank you, Luca. I know we can keep on going on this forever, but like we have to wrap up. So maybe we can do another
Thank you.
session sometime. Thank you so much for your
Yeah,
time, and enjoy rest of your evening. Really appreciate you having sharing it knowledge with us.
yeah. Thank you for having me anytime.
All right. Bye bye.